Okay, well, thank you. My name is Zdravka Todorova. Thank you for the invitation to participate in the MMT Summer School. Thank you to the organizers, Marcin, Philip, Gracian, Ivo, and everybody else who has been working on this conference. And I'm happy to be with you. I will talk about the importance of conceiving the economy as social provisioning, and what is the meaning of that in relation to our understanding of money, specifically as modern money. For those of you who do not know, my initial interest in this topic began years ago when I published in 2009 a book called Money and Households in a Capitalist Economy. And that basically took a post-Keynesian approach and broadened the post-Keynesian approach with an institutionalist and feminist perspective. And I explored critically the institution of money as well as gender relation, the importance of understanding gender relations in the economy, and specifically the role of unpaid work within the household, within the economy. And so that was my starting point. And eventually my work evolved, exploring further the concept of social provisioning, the role of class and other distinctions within the economy. And today I want to speak about one way to look at social provisioning as a central point in heterodox economics. My interest is the development of heterodox economic theory and grounding our understanding money and economic relations within heterodox economic theory. So let me start with making you think about ways that economic relations have been conceptualized, in my opinion, within economics. And this is kind of a spectrum. And let's start with the simplest and most prevalent way that economic relations are conceptualized within the economics discipline. And I call this reductionism because everything is understood through the prism of exchange. And exchange also is understood very narrowly. So you may recognize that basically all of mainstream economics is understood through the prism of exchange. And so, of course, heterodox economics wants for already, we can say centuries, but starting with political economy, of course, has looked at the economy beyond exchange. And so what has been the result of that? One way that heterodox economists have conceived economic relations is to oppose then exchange to gift relations. And this, in my opinion, results also in an unsatisfactory understanding of economic relations, because it results in a duality or an opposition of these two broad relations, exchange and gift. When you look at understanding the economy as basically exchange, we also are seeing that a lot of the analysis basically rely on understanding of money as a commodity. So when we engage in economic reductionism of understanding the economy as markets and understanding markets narrowly as exchange, we also dealing with a simple understanding of money as a commodity. And so, of course, this is where our understanding of modern money and my effort to look at the economy in a broader way intersect. So if we think about the exchange reductionism, we understand money is a commodity, even when we talk about modern innovations, such as, for example, cryptocurrencies. And so if you think about cryptocurrency as really producing nothing, but you can also think about it as producing a lot of waste, we also can kind of have an understanding of this kind of a commodity view of money. And of course, with all the negatives associated with that, which is basically kind of an ideological view of what the function of money is, which hides or views the actual processes that take place within the economy. And so similarly, just recently, as we have observed in the news, if a whole country is subjected to such an understanding of the role of money, that hides all the inequities and oppressions that take place in the economy. So we want to get out of this understanding, which is basically an ideological understanding of the economy in a reductionist way, which involves also moving away from understanding money as a commodity. Then when we move to the exchange versus gift, we want to break out of that dualistic thinking. And like I said, I think that in heterodox economics, a lot of this is still prevalent. That is a good starting point to understand the difference between gift relations, which basically involve an economic activity that doesn't expect anything in return. And to not conflate with exchange, like, for example, in the case of the concept of gift exchange, that's a conflation and a kind of a form of reductionism. But also, we do not want to oppose exchange versus gift as if they are two different spheres. So that has made me move towards these other distinctions, which of course are present in some of the heterodox literature, but I have spent some more time articulating those distinctions between exchange, gift relations, debt credit, and reciprocity. And that's a kind of a first step to explore a different context of economic relations, as well as a first step to look at the economy as broader than market and broader than exchange and broader than involving only monetary valuation. As you know, within modern money theory, which is based on the chartalism, money is defined as debt and credit. So it's a social relation. It's not a commodity, it's not a thing, it's not a veil of economic activity. But what I want to suggest that in addition to debt credit, certain monetary relation can exist also within different economic or social, different social or relations of sociality. So that brings me to introducing more nuances. So while this is a good starting point to understand the difference between exchange, gift, debt, credit, and reciprocity, and not to conflate any of those, it is even better to introduce further nuances, because that leads us to, or enables us to talk about or to analyze more context of how different economies are organized. So I will not go here in detail because I want to move into the concept of social provisioning. But I just want to mention that, like, for example, when we distinguish reciprocity from gift, this is a way to think about reciprocal relations that expect some sort of return or obligation versus gift, which is giving something without any necessarily expectation for a favor. At the same time, debt credit is a recorded obligation, monetary obligation. But at the same time, there are other obligations within the economy. So there could be obligations of social expectations that are directly related to sustaining the economy. And this is not the same as debt credit. So for this reason, it's important to think and to introduce these other relations outside of debt credit, but that are similar to debt credit. Similarly, when we think about gift, is this the same thing as sacrifice? This is another area of exploration to think about the role of money and monetary relation. Because a lot of monetary relations, in fact, involve sacrifice. And also they involve exploit. So these are kind of breaking down the basic, these four basic forms of, we can call them sociality or economic relations, and going further into the complexities of economic organization and economic relations. So for example, if we think about the place of tribute versus gift, I think it's important also to make such a distinction, especially in the context of hierarchies and hierarchical structure. Again, we can discuss this much further, and I kind of have recently written a little bit more on that. But this is the kind of a starting point to not just broaden our view of the economy beyond exchange, but also to escape the dualities, as well as to introduce more nuances into our understanding of the economy. And of course, one basic starting point, as I said, is to think about basic forms of sociality, but of course, to allow for a different context. So, I mean, if we think about forms of sociality in our economy, we can say that transacting is usually where economies stop. And this is in the example of exchange, for example. But then, of course, we have quite a lot of communal sharing, and not only within households and communities, but also even within a kind of a monetary relation, such as wage work and so forth. Then we have kind of equity keeping track, but informally, not in monetary terms. This is what we often refer to as reciprocity, although as I said before, there can be more complexities introduced to it. And then, of course, hierarchical ranking or authority ranking that involves relations such as, for example, debt credit. So my understanding of these forms of sociality are brought up from kind of reading more interdisciplinary literature, specifically in social psychology, but connecting it to our understanding of money means that we should also allow to move beyond kind of contrasting money to a market sphere and some sort of a non-monetary sphere. So what is our next step here? I want us to look a little bit more into this concept of social provisioning, which is basically directly related to what I just said, because we want to understand diverse relations in the economy. But in order to do that, we need to conceive of a system of processes. And so I will spend a little more time talking about this concept of process. And we can define, there are different ways of understanding social provisioning, but I have kind of defined it in this way to understand a system of processes generated by people in nature when people provide for each other. And when I say provide, it's not always the kind of a positive, peaceful thing. Provision of goods and services obviously involves not just care, but exploit and also oppression, violence, and so forth. And so these processes generate goods and services through the creation and distribution of resources and involve diverse relations. So these are some premises of what we can call social provisioning, or how this understanding of the economy as social provisioning departs from the mainstream understanding of the economy. These are premises that kind of have emerged from my reading of various approaches within heterodox economics. And just, of course, as a quick reminder, heterodox economics is the contemporary development of political economy. And in political economy, initially, a lot of kind of the more modern dualities did not exist, or they were not entrenched so much in the analysis. And so heterodox economics, really, I see it as dealing with some of those false and hierarchical dualisms that have populated modern economic analysis. And so the first feature of analyzing the economy as social provisioning is to move away from those hierarchical dualities, and kind of that was the subject of my first book in 2009, which basically critiqued the understanding of kind of private household sphere and opposing that to so-called public sphere of markets. And understanding modern money was one way to break out of that false dualism. But also there are many other dualist understanding of the economy versus nature, also productive, unproductive. This is particularly important when we talk about creating jobs for job guarantee program and achieving and maintaining full employment, understanding that exiting out of this simple notion of productive, unproductive is the main point. And of course, this is also very important from a kind of feminist perspective, which is what I take. But also material, immaterial type of dualistic thinking, which is actually coming out of institutional economics. I mean, the critique of this duality. There is a good critique that can be derived out of institutional economics. And there are quite a lot of other dualities that we can challenge. But there is also an importance within this understanding of the economy to conceive of a understanding of a dichotomy in valuation and provision. And this dichotomy is basically looking at the production process from two perspectives. From the perspective of what is produced out there is driven by financial interest within the capitalist economy. But of course, what is needed within the economy is basically understood as life concern, or what supports life within the economy. And within institutional economics, this dichotomy is understood as a kind of pecuniary valuation versus industrial valuation. And industrial means not just manufacturing, but industrial means what is technically needed for sustaining life. So I have a broader definition of industrial in this context. So I just want to point out not to conflate analytical duality, which is opposing two things that are actually connected, and also elevating one into a higher status, and that contributes to justifications of inequities and stratifications. And this duality is not the same as the ability to look at the production process and its complexity and its conflicts between financial concerns or business concern and industrial life concerns. Then third, of course, understanding money is a social relation, as I said, but understanding that money is a debt and credit, but also there are other relations, and also avoiding completely opposing this other relation, and also allowing for money to be a kind of a positive institution in terms of permitting livelihood. Of course, money has a function also of restricting livelihood. And one important point, of course, to understand money is a real variable. That was a kind of also what was taken by post-Keynesian economics and the importance in post-Keynesian economics of understanding money as real in terms of that it matters for business cycles, for the distribution, for financial instability, as well as for creating scarcity. And basically, this is directly related to what I said before about the dichotomy, that pecuniary valuation or monetary valuation is not the same thing as livelihood. That is like, sounds simple, but is really like the most fundamental thing that should be distinguishing heterodox economics from mainstream economics. And then, of course, the understanding that resources are created, including natural resources are created. Why? Because we have the dependency of development of knowledge, and this knowledge is never kind of created by only individuals. It's built on past experience, but also is social stock of knowledge. But at the same time, saving is done in monetary terms individually. And so we have often preoccupation with monetary savings by individuals, funding investment and so on. But at the same time, the social stock of knowledge is created by society overall. And again, to emphasize here the importance of post-Keynesian thought of, and of course Keynes, of reversing the causation from saving for investment, but also from an institutionalist thought, understanding that monetary saving has not a generative function within the economy. It's not just a residual, but also is a manifestation of distribution that is channeled by depending how society is organized in a class and hierarchical way. So just reversing the understanding that saving has not generative function, but instead focusing on creating resources and exiting out of this kind of created scarcity is a main goal, and also main premise of social provisioning in terms of understanding the economy. And this is directly also related to modern money's kind of major element that we have of the role of taxes in spending in the economy, and particularly that spending precedes taxes. Now, spending directly means that money has permitted the creation of resources, and the taxes, of course, are the result of the residual in a way. They can be collected only after spending has taken place. But this spending has to be refocused, of course, on addressing the so-called industrial or life concerns. Of course, the mere creation of resources is a political and a kind of a hierarchical outcome of how the economy is socially organized, and that is another element of understanding social provisioning, understanding the stratification and distinction, and not just random distinction, but invidious distinction, is at the center of creating resources and how resources are distributed. Of course, the biggest challenge is how can we have an economy that is based on non-invidious recreation of communities. We already established that each economy is communal, but the communities themselves can contribute to oppression and distinction. So the challenge is, how to get into non-invidious recreation of communities. Finally, as I mentioned, given all that, we cannot just talk about fixed independent categories or events or outcomes. What the main analytical category should be processes, and also the individuals, not as independent kind of individuals that are kind of almost automaton, but real agents. This means that they're embodied, they're real people. The economic agents should be analyzed with having basically physical, biological vulnerabilities. People expire, people have needs, deprivations, and so on. And people are codependent, which means also that care is a central economic process. Now, I just want to give you a kind of a snapshot. This is a work that I did in an attempt to provide a starting point for understanding the economy as a system of processes. And basically, this comes from a lot from institutional economics, but really is also an attempt to bring forward many heterodox approaches and to put by understanding of empirical literatures and these different approaches, and to use this as a starting point of any, let's say, a case study or dealing with quite a lot of theoretical questions that we have within heterodox economics. The first thing to note is that while I have here natural, economic, and social, of course, the big point that social provisioning can make is that those are not separate spheres. This is just a kind of basic understanding that the economy is located within biospheric processes, that agents have bodies with different needs and functions, and then we occupy physical space. Of course, the whole point is that none of those are fixed in a sense that these are kind of given immutable category. Once again, I'm talking about here processes. Each one of these is a process, means that it's understanding, our understanding of each of these changes over time with building knowledge, but also within different economies and cultures. There is like also kind of a evolutionary understanding. Also, the categories can actually change themselves. Once again, these are not categories, but these are a process again. Then when we look at what is the economy, remember how we started with the economy as being just market exchange. Well, here, if we view every single thing as only market exchange, that's one approach. But if we have a different analysis that is based on these forms of sociality that I talked about at the very beginning, we are going to have a different understanding, for example, of care, of labor, recreation, consumption. And So I have limited amount of time here, and you can read the paper, which goes over each one of those basically, and discusses why I have named them like that. They're not random words. They are coming out of a kind of attempt to understand the economy in a more critical way. So in addition to care, labor, consumption, recreation, mobility and residence is something that is quite relevant also for understanding money, because mobility involves also liquidity, for example. So all of those are kind of constructed in a way that they are not simplistic, and they're not viewed only through the usual, consumption, distribution, saving, and so forth, but they introduce further ability to engage for the kind of analysis. Then communication, expression, persuasion. Well, this includes, for example, our expert discourse of what money is. Of course, all of these are going to be useful in a specific context when we try to formulate a research question. I'm here only emphasizing quickly with respect to money and our understanding of money, what are some importances. Cultivation and transmission of knowledge tools, as well as memories. I have tried to keep those connected, but also kind of to introduce some sort of levels or layers of human activity. This, for example, includes our understanding of an ability to transmit a new understanding of the role of money in the economy. Resource creation and the direction and usage of resources, undertaking, which is another process that involves investment, but also mobilization generally of resources. Investment is a specifically directed activity towards markets and making profit in market, but there is quite a lot of so-called investment that is not about making money, but it's undertaking, for example, within communities and so forth. So that's why I use this term. And then coming out of institutional economics, there's quite a lot of literature on the so-called machine process, which is basically what we call production, but there is quite a lot of to talk about production, not just the production of goods, but how it affects our social relations. So machine process, for example, how the work of the worker has changed over time. And for example, even if you think about this all virtual activities, we can think quite a lot of modern context. I already mentioned about those so-called social relations. They really analyze them. I analyze them as processes. So let's move to supervision and surveillance. This is the fundamental process in a contemporary economy that I don't need right now to convince you about. Threat and punishment, extremely important of having an economy operating below full employment consistently, or the threat and punishment of being without livelihood, and so forth. And of course, distribution in terms of everything being grounded in political economy, of course, is central. But I also want to point out the role of understanding prices, prices being administered, and this is one area that in modern money should be further explored, as well as the policies that are being created, that they, of course, are distributive, and moving away from deficits and surplus as the kind of the guiding light of making policies. And of course, this is the biggest challenge that we have with respect to functional finance and job guarantee and so forth. Finally, we talk about consumption and resource creation, but really also we should analyze deprivation. This is a process in the economy that has to do with not just deprivation in terms of consumption of goods, but education and other capabilities and so forth. Then waste often is forgotten in terms of what is going on in the economy. I gave you the example with the cryptocurrency, even though these are not commodities, it's basically production of waste, and no economy should be organized on the base of that. Of course, waste always within the economy generates income or free income, rents, and so forth for somebody, but overall does not benefit the life process. Then violence, of course, is fundamental. I should say here that all of those processes are interrelated. Obviously, I'm just listing them as a kind of a reminder. And so when we do research, we can start with some of this, depending on what is our context and research problem. The point is to remember and to connect them to each, to all of those. Finally, again, I emphasize this as the so-called economic, but just because we relate them to economic activities, but I started from the beginning that the economy is broader, should be seen in a broader term, and the usual so-called social, which oftentimes they are reduced to either categories or identities or demographics or dummy variables and so on. There is a literature within heterodox economics that has, try to exit these simple definitions, and outside, of course, especially within feminist theory, but generally social theory. But so I see, for example, those as processes. So for example, gender is a process. So that takes you out from like predetermined categories, let alone from a kind of a binary understanding. By the way, binary either or is something that usually that you cannot find much of it in life systems, but also takes us out from a kind of dualities, as well as from this understanding of gender as a category, which was one way to move further from understanding of gender as demographics, right? But I'm saying that gender, for example, is a process, should be seen as something that we change our understanding, first of all. And that kind of allows a more open social analysis of the economy. I don't want to spend too much time on why I have divided those two. But I have those two groups. One is kind of so-called social processes that are not directly governed by a going concern, but of course are affected. But I should say that we can, because this is a kind of a evolutionary picture, right? We can, in a specific context, those can move into the category of where they're specifically driven by economic concern, by a going concern. So, for example, if you think about citizenship, you cannot conceive of it without the state, without the existence of the state. That's why I have put it in this kind of category that is, but its mere existence is because of state. If you don't have state, you don't have kind of citizenship. But gender, while it can be directed and affected and even predetermine what is gender, for example, by state, it does not exist because state, so it can have other determinants outside of state. So my point in this separation is to point out that some categories are not entirely determined by state, and also that gives also opportunities for how they should be challenged outside of that. But again, everything will be within the specific context. This is not a specific theory. This is a kind of a meta framework that is also an evolutionary and it's simply to enable a specific theorizing within context. So economic class, not conflated with a social class, ownership, contracts and justice system, worship and kinship. As I said, my initial inquiry started from households, and that from the last kind of 15, decade or 15 years, maybe a decade, has kind of moved towards conceptualizing social provisioning. These are just the processes, but again, to remind you, they are part also, they're not fixed, they're part of different forms of sociality. Just this is a reminder of what I said before. At the end, what is the process actually? The point is, we are not talking only about activity or outcomes, let's say saving in monetary terms, there's a specific outcome, but the saving itself is determined by many what we can call factors, but it's a result of many of those things, which I call them those analytical categories. So if you think about, I wrote about consumption process as well as debt credit process. So you can think about a process is comprised by different elements such as activities, identities, conventions, working rules, procedures, social norms, social beliefs, conventional wisdom, how things work, rhetorical device. So the debt clock is a rhetorical device that is ticking, right? Sign, symbol, there are rituals, institutions, and going concerns such as household, business enterprise, and whatever. The point here is, and these are not random words, this is mostly coming based on from institutional theory, really, my interpretation. What I am seeing a lot in heterodox economics is a kind of vague usage of the words social norms, institutions, and so forth. And my attempt here, of course, in my writings, is to introduce some more specific language of what do we actually mean by institutions? What do we mean by relations? By that is why I'm introducing these complexities and forms of sociality. So then in the previous picture, each one of those process is comprised by those activities. Are those predetermined? No. The analysis will depend on what is the specific research question in specific context. So to me, this is kind of just a useful way to do research that also allows for more complex understanding of money that modern money, of course, has as an objective. And my objective is to ground in this, to ground a kind of modern money within heterodox theory, but also to ground it in this, the kind of broader understanding of the economy, and that connects obviously to other disciplines and efforts. So the implication is money should be understood as having part of diverse economic relations and social processes, not in a separate sphere. Beyond, we want to move beyond static and immutable categories, and hence the discussion of process, reducing, we want to move beyond reducing the economy to exchange and commodities. That's important for what is possible in terms of action, undertaking, mobilization, and policy. We want to move beyond the analytical compartments of different and opposed sphere of life. Those are usually myths, but not just myths. Those are stratification myths and excuses for status quo and exploit. Markets, we want to move beyond markets versus society. I don't see any more difference between society and economy for one, but also there should not be simplified understanding of what markets are. Markets, to be taken seriously, have to be understood as social, They may have asocial or antisocial results, in other words, social cost, but they're socially organized. So they're not opposed to this kind of friendly, nice sphere of community. Community can be extremely oppressive. But obviously, everything that I said before about understanding that markets should not be conflated to livelihood states. And then all of this is related to moving away from this notion of the taxpayers' money or paying for and so on narrative. I have given you here kind of the broad picture of understanding the economy as social provisioning. Again, the objective is to uncover context of oppressions, as well as to recover or uncover various agencies and possibilities, and to uncover the restrictive capacities of money that we're living under, as well as the permissive capacity of money, to have what I can call evolutionary intersectionalities. The picture of the processes that I gave you, this is kind of what I understand as intersectional, or the basis of intersectionality or intersectional analysis. They're evolutionary, however, we're not matching categories that are fixed and so on. And this opens more possibility to redirect public purpose and so on, to have undertaking and mobilization, and to envision and implement, hopefully, job guarantees. Now, this is, of course, just the theoretical level, but what is the next kind of step? All of this leads to having refocusing from monetary scarcity to human needs as a basis for resource creation. And what I have envisioned here is a lot of based really on work from a lot of heterodox approaches, institutional feminist capabilities approaches. And this is just a kind of a snapshot of a picture of how can we see differently the object of the economy or the subject of the economy, and what people need in terms of creating capabilities, communities, nature and health, the individual envisioned within nature, in society, in their connection, belonging, as well as individuality, creativity, the role of workmanship, work as not being just defined as wage work, but actually is part of what people want to contribute, curiosity in terms of our ability to envision new areas of activities and redirecting the economy, including envisioning new type of jobs, new ways of organizing work. And of course, having as central care, livelihood, and also re-envisioning what is security, right? This is very broad, obviously, and challenging in our everyday lives. But with this, I want to leave you as the kind of the center for how we should create and direct resources, and also envision kind of the role of understanding modern money today. So with that, I will let you, and hopefully we have some time for some discussion. I would just add that I have sent a PDF of this presentation, and at the end of the PDF, I have included some links to some of the works that this is based on, some of my works. Like I said, all of this is my attempt an experience of working within various heterodox approaches, and those works refer to authors within heterodox economics. So feel free to circulate the PDF, Grazian and others, to students if they're interested.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zdravka. So we can start a question and answer session. Do you have any questions? And do you hear me, Zdravka?
I hear.
Yes?
Yes.
Great. If someone wants to ask a question, you can speak up, or I can bring you a microphone.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so you also touched on it a little bit when you were talking, but so using the combining the gender and the institutional analysis with respect to the job guarantee, there's been a rising belief, recently that the job guarantee in the US is being limited to just infrastructure projects, and it should be expanded a little bit more. And using this capabilities approach that you just mentioned, there's been this rising belief that it should be expanding to artists and like the musicians, so that it should be it should include like a, how can I say, a cultural job guarantee as well, just to say the exact word. So what do you think about this? I think it falls in line with what you just said, but I want to get your opinion on it as well. Thank you.
Yes. So obviously there is a tradition in that, going back to the New Deal in the United States. There are quite a lot of art projects. I mean, we can go back and look at history. We don't have to replicate everything in history, but we can learn from what was done. Also, we can look at local communities, what is being done in local nonprofits, for example, or also what is needed. There are many different ways that those needs can be identified. Actually, I kind of have a talk coming in October that is going to talk more about identifying non-market needs, including art projects and including involving young people as well as elderly, I would say, people. This is totally the direction of one direction that should be taken. So a long time ago, when I wrote a little bit about employer of last resort and social provisioning, there is actually, here is the old paper, and socialization of investment. I try to connect those two concepts of investment and social provisioning. But this 2009, now we can also use the previous picture that I showed you in what is needed by humans and the economy, looking at the human agent, the economic agent as a whole. Art, obviously, is part of what people need for their lives. People are not just workers and consumers. We know that we need to sustain ourselves as individuals art. So moving away from this productive and unproductive and so forth, in terms of job creation, is a major achievement. So I definitely agree with that. I mean, I'm not saying everything goes and everything is relativistic, but there is quite a lot of communal projects of local development that incorporate directly art. This includes reconstruction of buildings and so forth, that directly can improve not just the artists, but everybody's lives and surroundings. Like I said, this is my kind of objective, to look at our lives in this interconnected and broader way, and to redefine many of the kind of fixed categories of what is work, what is investment, and so forth. So I agree with that, of course.
Okay. Do we have other questions? As I don't understand, it was an exhausting day for participants. So
Yes.
Yeah, let's wait 1 minute more and. Okay, so we have one.
I've got a question because I recently read up on Fred Lee's work, and I saw that it's also like you also wrote about him, and I think one of the things that he in his work pointed out is that to forge a kind of method of economic inquiry, and I think your work is like this really big picture social where everything is included. So I wanted to ask how methodologically you would perhaps when someone would do an economic study, someone like a specific field or something like a specific artifact, to draw it together and make something like with a grounded approach to study, how you would say for perhaps a student how to approach this with your framework with that. Okay, sorry, it's a little bit far perhaps, but yeah, would like to know a bit of thoughts on that.
Yeah. So you're right that Fred Lee has influenced me in terms of, well, he was my advisor. So my initial attempt was to combine the heterodox micro, or some elements of heterodox micro approach. This is when I was starting to write, with the macro that was coming out of Randall Ray at that time. And so I started using households as the focal point, and that's what resulted in my first book. And then eventually, and there is quite a lot of in this book. If you read, you are going to see how I'm trying to combine the heterodox micro with neo-chartalist and post-Keynesian generally approach and so forth. Later on, I kind of moved more in depth within the concept of social provisioning, which also Fred Lee had kind of started picking up more about 2009 and 10, 11, and started writing more with others like Tahi Joe and so forth. And then I kind of broadened this social provisioning in the way that I discussed to also kind of include feminist insights of unpaid work, but also in all of those processes that I discussed that are more so-called social, as well as nature and so forth. So in terms of methodology, like I pointed out, this is more of a meta narrative used only for starting point. You were right to point out Fred Lee emphasized grounded theory. Okay, but grounded theory, one thing that he also pointed out, and maybe you know, it's not going to the field without any conceptions. The point is, however, those conceptions to be changing as you meet the field. So you need some analytical categories, but they're not fixed. They have to be changing. So in terms of what I will recommend, what I will say first of all, get out of these vague notions of everything is institutions, everything is social norms, and try to include some precision into your language. It doesn't need to be my language, obviously. That's how I think about questions, empirical questions, when I come across. But second, my hope, my recommendation, or hope actually, would be when you look at, let's say you're interested in some empirical question, when you are formulating a research question, well, take a look and think about this broad picture of interconnection. You are going to make these processes maybe differently or see them differently, but my hope is that this is going to kind of help people to broaden their question, reformulate their question, rethink their question in terms of how it is connected to some spheres that usually we have taken as a kind of almost autonomous or separate, or to just rethink. And I think that that will have an effect on how you see and analyze the empirical findings that you find in your field. So this is my kind of recommendation or hope. It's a kind of a more structured way of looking at connections without being rigid or without falling also into a kind of a complete inductivism where or relativism also. One thing, since you mentioned Fred Lee, he was very much interested in developing theory, heterodox theory. Also, first of all, of course, with respect to his price theory, which he called it was a grounded theory, but he was not satisfied only at looking at a particular only empirical studies without developing theory or engaging in what he called descriptive analysis of what's in the news, which of course informs everything that we do, but the eye should be in developing alternative theory.
Okay, we have another question from Patricia.
I just wanted to hear your thoughts on, you talked a lot about the importance of the arts for individuals and, you know, just as a creative asset and thinking of individuals more than as just simply consumers and workers. And often when we talk about things like the job guarantee and, for example, the creation of public art, one of the aspects of this is that people are very mistrusting of art that is, funded by an authority or central authority, because they see government as sort of controlling a certain message or favoring certain messages in art, and they see that sort of against the ideals of individual creativity. And the contrast to that is, of course, the system that we have now, where we have actually a small section of private individuals basically making that selection for the rest of us. And I was wondering whether you gave any thought about how a system that incorporates the arts into an individual's, an inherent part of an individual's need might work, and how decentralized does it need to be?
Well, centralization within the job guarantee is not about decision making so much as it is about providing the funds or the money centrally, right? The job guarantee is not about directing what sort of art should be done, although I should say, if there is, I will not support, let's say, somebody drawing swastikas everywhere, right? That's not art. That aside, because it just promotes hate. But aside that, I think that this fear, as you described it, I think that this is not a concern, because the understanding should be that those activities should be organized locally, and the decentralized activities are driven by communities, and the funding is central. Now, that said, there could be communities that are engaging in undesirable things, like I just said. But I am not sure that there is some connection between driving the actual activities centrally and the funding. I mean, that should be kind of worked out, right? The point is to provide central funding and local decisions. So this is what I would say to that question. We don't want centrally dictated art, no. And I don't think that that's, sometimes we have these fears, is like, because we're looking back to this kind of Cold War thinking, which, by the way, Cold War thinking is prevalent today with regards to public policy funding and so forth. And I think we just have to get out of it, because we have this monumental kind of understanding of what is socialism, what is capitalism, idealized folklore type of understanding of what is capitalism as opposed to socialism, and then assigning central versus decentralized, assigning central to socialism, but then forgetting that capitalism is centrally planned too, in terms of markets are centrally organized, that there is no real division within capitalism between markets and state. That, of course, this is the kind of the liberal notion of duality, but of course, neoliberalism flourished on this interaction between markets and state. So today, all markets are not separate from a state because there is influence of what the state provides and so forth. So this is the kind of the duality that I wanted, I want us to get out of it. That is part of communication, expression, persuasion, cultivation of knowledge and so forth. We as educators, we want to make our students think outside of these old tropes of Cold War thinking, of what is market, what is the state, what is centralization, what is decentralization. And I think that's the first challenge. Sometimes we have these fears that really are just the kind of old ideologies, and we should just look at what communities are doing, what people are needing. The biggest challenge is, of course, to give freedom to individuals and individual communities to meet their needs and capabilities.